The story begins with silence, a silence broken only by the whisper of water against the rocky shore. Tucked away in the heart of the pine forest stood a cabin, simple yet proud, built with the hands of a man who believed in dignity, family, and peace. That cabin wasn't just wood and stone. It was a symbol. A black man's stake in land and history where so many times the world tried to tell him he had no place. His name was James Carter, a retired schoolteacher who had spent his life teaching children, not just equations and grammar, but resilience. He was not wealthy, but the cabin, his lake cabin, was his sanctuary. It was the place where his grandchildren learned to fish, where family gathered to laugh, cook, and remember that even in a world that often denied them respect, they still belonged. But not everyone saw it that way. For some, James's cabin by the lake was an eyesore simply because of the man who owned it. The Homeowners Association, an HOA board that prided itself on exclusivity and control, had long made James their target. They nitpicked everything: the shade of his paint, the style of his deck chairs, even the small wooden cross carved into the cabin's frame. And yet, James always paid his dues on time, always followed the rules he never agreed with, and always smiled through their sneers. Until one day a notice appeared. A letter, cold and sharp as a knife, slipped under his door. "You are delinquent on HOA fees. Pay immediately or face enforcement actions." James was confused. He had the receipts, every canceled check, every digital payment. He had proof. But the board refused to listen. To them, his voice didn't matter. His evidence didn't matter. What mattered was power, and they believed he had none. Within weeks, the situation escalated. James received another letter, this one more threatening. Failure to comply will result in property, seizure, and demolition. His family urged him to fight back, to call a lawyer, to make noise. But James, ever the calm teacher, believed in process. "They'll see the mistake," he told his daughter Alicia. "They'll do the right thing. You can't build a community by tearing people down." But the HOA did not see it that way. To them, James was expendable. And one cold morning, while James was away at the city for a doctor's appointment, bulldozers rolled down the dirt road leading to his lake cabin. Neighbors watched from their porches as machines groaned to life. The crew hired by the HOA moved with brutal efficiency. Walls cracked. The roof caved. Windows shattered. The cabin, the heart of James's family, was reduced to rubble within hours. And when James returned, all that greeted him was smoke rising from splinters and ash. The pain that washed over him was indescribable. His knees buckled. For a moment, he could not breathe. This was not just a cabin destroyed. This was a legacy stripped bare, a history bulldozed under the weight of arrogance and cruelty. He stood in silence as his grandchildren wept, as his daughter clenched her fists, as the board president, smirking from across the lake, watched it all unfold with folded arms. What the HOA did not know, however, was that James's family was not ordinary. His children had grown up under his lessons of resilience and discipline, and they had chosen careers that reflected those values. His daughter Alicia was a federal prosecutor. His son Marcus was an FBI agent. His nephew Elijah worked in Homeland Security. They were a family stitched together not only by blood, but by service and duty. And that day when they stood among the ruins, a silent oath formed between them. This would not end here. James tried to keep his calm demeanor. He placed his hand on Alicia's shoulder and said softly, "We will not let anger define us. We will let truth and justice lead the way." Yet inside he was broken. He had played by the rules, trusted the process, and still, they had crushed him. The family gathered in Alicia's home that evening. The air was heavy, the silence almost unbearable, until Marcus spoke. "They think they can get away with this. They think because you're one man, retired, soft-spoken, that they can erase you. They don't know who they just stepped on." His voice trembled with both rage and conviction. Elijah leaned forward, his hands pressed on the table. "This isn't about property anymore. It's about dignity. They need to learn what accountability looks like when you try to strip a man of his humanity." James shook his head slowly. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want justice. I want them to see me as human. That's all I ever wanted." Alicia's eyes filled with tears, but her jaw hardened. "Then we'll give you that. We'll fight the way we know how, with the law, with the truth, with every tool we have." The battle that followed was not quick, nor was it simple. Lawsuits were filed. Complaints were lodged. Every crooked maneuver by the HOA was exposed under the bright light of scrutiny. Alicia, with her mastery of the courtroom, dismantled their arguments piece by piece. Marcus, with federal access, traced the board's financial records, uncovering years of corruption and embezzlement. Elijah, meticulous and unrelenting, documented every violation of due process. But beyond the legal fight, there was something deeper at play. The story of James's demolished cabin began to spread. Local newspapers picked it up. Then regional outlets. Soon, national headlines carried the story. Black retirees, lake cabin demolished over disputed fees. The public outrage was fierce. For many, it wasn't just about one man's loss. It was about the centuries-old story of black property, black progress being undermined by those in power. James, though heartbroken, became a quiet symbol of resistance. Interviews painted him not as a bitter man, but as a dignified father and teacher who had given everything to his community, only to be robbed of his peace. People rallied behind him. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to speak out. Former HOA members confessed past intimidation. The board, once smug, now trembled under the weight of exposure. Their president, so bold in front of James's ruined home, was now reduced to stammering in court, facing not only civil penalties but federal investigations. The power dynamic had shifted, and through it all, James remained steady. He often said to his grandchildren, "They took down wood and nails, but they can't take down our spirit, remember that." The weeks turned into months, and what began as a private tragedy for James Carter became a national conversation. News outlets framed it as another example of systemic injustice, how black families, even when they follow every rule, can still have their dignity stripped away by arrogance and prejudice. But for James and his family, it was more than a headline. It was daily life. Every time he drove past the empty lot where his cabin once stood, a piece of his heart ached. Yet every time he saw his children working tirelessly to bring the truth to light, he felt a surge of pride stronger than grief. The HOA board had underestimated not just James, but the power of family. In depositions, Alicia's sharp questioning broke through the board members' carefully rehearsed lies. Marcus produced records showing that James had in fact overpaid his fees for years, his checks quietly deposited even as the board claimed delinquency. Elijah uncovered internal emails between board members mocking James, referring to him as that old man who doesn't belong here, and openly discussing how to push him out. It was blatant. It was cruel. And now it was exposed. As hearings moved forward, the HOA tried to paint themselves as protectors of community standards. Their president, a man named Charles Whitmore, insisted in court that the demolition was a necessary enforcement action to preserve the neighborhood's property values. But when Alicia rose to her feet, documents in hand, and read aloud the email where Whitmore had written, "Once the cabin is gone, we won't have to look at him anymore," the courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even the judge's face tightened with visible disgust. The tide was turning. But justice, as James knew, was never straightforward. The board's attorneys dragged out the process, hoping time and fatigue would wear down the Carter family. They filed motions to dismiss, buried the family in paperwork, and spun public statements about misunderstandings and clerical errors. James grew tired. His body, already weakened by age, carried the weight of stress like stones in his chest. Some nights he sat alone, staring at old photographs of his cabin, whispering prayers for strength. Yet his family never faltered. Alicia kept pushing, her voice steady even when her eyes were heavy from sleepless nights. Marcus balanced his federal duties with relentless investigation, while Elijah meticulously built timelines that prosecutors could not ignore. They carried James's fight on their shoulders, fueled not just by duty but by love. And slowly, the cracks in the HOA's wall of power widened. A former board secretary came forward, testifying that she had warned Whitmore against targeting James but was silenced. A demolition crew worker revealed that he had asked to see proof of authority before tearing the cabin down, but was threatened with losing his job. Piece by piece, the facade crumbled. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A federal inquiry, triggered by the exposure of corruption, revealed that Whitmore and several board members had embezzled thousands of dollars from HOA funds over the years, funneling money into personal accounts, while blaming homeowners for delinquencies. James had not only been innocent, he had been a victim of theft. His cabin was demolished not because of unpaid fees, but because his presence, his identity, and his dignity stood in the way of men who believed they owned power. The outrage was immediate. Protesters gathered outside HOA meetings. Neighbors hung signs that read, "Justice for James." Social media swelled with calls for accountability. National figures began speaking out, connecting James's story to a broader history of black landowners being dispossessed, their property taken, their voices dismissed. Through it all, James remained remarkably composed. In one televised interview, his words carried the weight of both pain and resilience. They thought they were tearing down a cabin. What they were really tearing down was trust, faith in fairness, faith in community. But you can't bulldoze the human spirit. We are still here. When the verdict finally came, it was more than a legal decision, it was a declaration. The court found the HOA guilty of wrongful demolition, fraud, and civil rights violations. They were ordered to pay millions in damages to James and his family. Whitmore faced federal charges for embezzlement and fraud, his smirk long gone, replaced by the grim reality of handcuffs and prison walls. But the victory was not in the money. It was in the acknowledgement. The court recognized James's dignity. The nation recognized his story. His family's fight had ensured that the truth was not buried beneath rubble. And yet, when the dust settled, James returned to that empty lot by the lake. He stood in the silence, the water still whispering against the rocks, and for the first time since the demolition, he allowed himself to cry. He cried not just for what was lost, but for what was reclaimed. His grandchildren held his hands. Alicia stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Elijah whispered, "We'll rebuild." And rebuild they did. Not just a cabin, but a new chapter. Volunteers from across the community came forward, offering labor, supplies, and support. Local carpenters, inspired by James's story, donated their time. Architects offered designs free of charge. The new cabin rose not as a monument of defeat, but as a symbol of resilience. Every nail, every beam carried the weight of solidarity. When the cabin was finally completed, the Carter family gathered once again at the lake. This time there were hundreds of people, friends, neighbors, even strangers standing with them. James cut the ribbon, his hands trembling, his eyes glistening. He spoke softly, but his words carried across the crowd. They thought they could erase us, but here we are, standing, stronger than before. This cabin is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Applause thundered. Children ran to the water's edge. The air was alive with laughter, with hope, with the sound of dignity restored. And in that moment, James Carter's story became more than a battle against an HOA. It became a testament that no matter how many times injustice tries to knock down walls, the foundation of dignity cannot be destroyed. It was a reminder that justice is not just about punishment, but about restoration, about building again what others tried to tear down. For James, the cabin was never just a building. It was memory. It was heritage. It was proof that he, and families like his, deserved space, respect, and peace. And though he bore scars of what had been taken, he stood taller because of what had been reclaimed. As the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, casting a golden glow on the lake, James whispered a final prayer of thanks. Not just for the cabin, not just for justice, but for the unbreakable truth he had carried all along. They can take wood, they can take stone, but they cannot take our dignity. That is ours forever. And with that, the Carter family's story was etched not only in wood and stone, but in the hearts of everyone who believed in justice, resilience, and the unshakable dignity of a man who refused to be erased. The cabin stood tall again, stronger and more beautiful than before, but the story didn't end with its rebuilding. For James Carter and his family, the victory was more than personal, it was generational. Word of what had happened continued to spread, weaving itself into conversations about land, justice, and dignity for black families across the nation. His story became a touchstone for those who had lost far more than cabins, for those whose homes and dreams had been taken silently, without cameras, without headlines, without the chance to fight back. Universities invited James to speak. Civil rights organizations reached out, asking him to share his journey. He always began with humility, often saying, "I am not a hero. I'm just a man who wanted a place for his family. But if my fight helped someone else hold on to their place, then it was worth it." His words resonated because they came not from anger, but from quiet strength. Yet James also understood that his story struck a deeper chord, because it carried echoes of history. Generations before him had been denied land, had their farms seized, their property undervalued, their communities redlined. His cabin was just one thread in a tapestry of systemic dispossession. What made his different was that this time, the world had seen it. This time, justice had spoken loudly enough to be heard. The Carter children felt the weight of that legacy. Alicia began using her legal skills to represent families facing unfair housing practices. Marcus joined national panels about discrimination in property law. Elijah helped organize training programs for community leaders to understand their rights against predatory associations and boards. Each of them, in their own way, turned pain into purpose. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was in the grandchildren. They had seen their grandfather weep in front of rubble. They had seen injustice with their own eyes. And then they had seen dignity restored through resilience and unity. For them, the cabin was not just a vacation home. It was a classroom without walls, a living lesson that history could wound but also heal. They began calling it Grandpa's Lighthouse, because, as one of them explained, it shows us where to stand when the world gets dark. The community around the lake changed too. Neighbors who had once looked away when James was targeted now carried their own sense of shame. Some apologized in private. Some offered help in public. The Carter family accepted kindness, but never let people forget how silence had allowed cruelty to grow unchecked. Community, James reminded them, is not just living side by side. It's standing up when you see wrong. Meanwhile, the HOA system itself came under scrutiny. Legislators cited James's case as proof that unchecked power in private associations could lead to abuse. Hearings were held, new policies proposed, and watchdog organizations formed. Across the country, families began challenging their own unfair HOAs, pointing to James's case as precedent. In a way, his cabin, once demolished in silence, now stood as a rallying cry. But the weight of it all was not easy. James, though proud, carried scars invisible to most. Sometimes late at night, he would sit on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, listening to the water, remembering the sound of the bulldozers. The trauma lingered. He often whispered prayers not just for his family, but for others who had not been as fortunate, whose homes were lost forever. His grief was private, his resilience public. Both were real. One autumn evening, a young black couple approached James at a community event. They had seen his story on television. Tears filled their eyes as they explained how their grandparents had lost land to crooked officials decades earlier. "They never got it back," the young woman said softly. "But because of you, we know we can fight. We know we can demand better." James clasped their hands, his voice gentle but firm. "Then carry it forward. Don't let my story end with me. Make it your beginning." And they did. Many did. James's struggle became part of a broader movement. Whispered in living rooms, preached in churches, taught in classrooms. It reminded people that dignity was not a gift given by the powerful, it was an inheritance, a right. Something that could not be bulldozed or stolen if enough people stood together. The rebuilt cabin soon became more than a family retreat. It became a gathering place for activists, community leaders, and families seeking hope. Workshops were held there. Storytelling circles filled its rooms. Children from the neighborhood came to fish off its dock, laughing in the sunlight. What was once meant to isolate James had become a beacon of unity. As the years passed, James aged gracefully, his body slowing but his spirit unyielding. On his 81st birthday, surrounded by family, he stood on the porch and looked out at the lake. "I won't be here forever," he said, his voice trembling yet clear. "But this cabin, this story, this fight, it belongs to you now. Guard it, protect it, and remember they can tear down walls, but they cannot tear down who we are." Tears flowed, hugs tightened, and in that moment, every member of the Carter family knew they carried not just his legacy, but the weight of countless others whose voices had been silenced. When James passed quietly in his sleep a few years later, the nation mourned. Newspapers ran obituaries not just of a teacher, but of a man whose dignity had sparked a movement. His funeral drew hundreds, family, friends, neighbors, activists, even strangers who had been moved by his story. And as his casket was lowered, Alicia whispered through her tears, "Rest now, Daddy, we'll keep building." The cabin remains today, standing strong against time and memory, its walls echoing with laughter and prayer. A plaque on its porch bears James's words. "They can take wood. They can take stone, but they cannot take our dignity. That is ours forever." Visitors who come to the lake stop to read it. Many leave flowers. Some simply stand in silence, letting the weight of those words settle in their hearts. And every year on the anniversary of the demolition, the Carter family gathers by the water. They light lanterns and release them into the night sky, each one carrying a prayer for justice, for resilience, for dignity unbroken. The lanterns rise, glowing against the darkness, just as James's story continues to rise, reminding the world that even when injustice tries to erase us, the light of truth, family, and dignity will always shine through. Years after James Carter's passing, the lake still carried his memory like ripples across the water. His cabin, rebuilt and preserved, stood not only as a family sanctuary, but as a beacon to thousands who drew strength from his story. Over time, it came to be known simply as the Carter House of Dignity. Teachers brought students there to learn about civil rights history. Churches organized retreats. Activists held gatherings on its porch, telling their own stories of struggle and resilience beneath the same roof that had once been reduced to ash. The Carter family had promised to carry James's legacy forward, and they did so with devotion. Alicia expanded the Carter Justice Initiative into a national network, offering free legal defense to families facing unjust HOA boards, predatory lenders, and unlawful property seizures. The foundation quickly became a lifeline for communities across the country. Cases poured in, stories eerily similar to James's, though many never reached the news. Families who thought they were alone suddenly realized they were part of something larger. Marcus, still serving in federal law enforcement, became a voice inside the system. He worked to implement training for agents on recognizing discriminatory housing practices, ensuring that what had happened to his father would not slip past the eyes of those sworn to uphold the law. His colleagues often said he carried the case like a badge over his heart. Elijah, meticulous as ever, built data systems that tracked HOA complaints nationwide. His work gave policymakers real evidence of a pattern too long ignored. The grandchildren, now teenagers, carried the story in their own ways. One of them, young Isaiah, began writing essays and poems inspired by his grandfather's resilience. At a school assembly, he recited one of his poems. "You can break the cabin, but not the man. You can burn the wood, but not the plan. His dignity stood where the ashes fell, and the world will remember his story to tell." The room fell silent and then erupted in applause. James's light burned brightly through them. But James's story was no longer just the Carters to hold. Across the country, other families began telling their stories, finding courage in his. A black farmer in Georgia, wrongfully fined by his HOA, won his case after citing the Carter precedent. A widow in Texas, threatened with foreclosure over disputed fees, found legal protection through the Carter Justice Initiative. Slowly, brick by brick, the wall of silence began to crack. National media returned to the Carter cabin years later, producing a documentary titled "Dignity Cannot Be Demolished." The film retraced James's journey, from his quiet days as a teacher to the brutal demolition, and finally to the rebuilding of both the cabin and his legacy. It aired to millions, sparking dialogue about systemic injustice, the history of black land loss, and the power of resilience. Viewers wept, tweeted, marched, and demanded reforms. James's voice, though gone, continued to echo, and yet with visibility came new burdens. The Carter family received both praise and backlash. Supporters sent letters of thanks, sharing stories of how James had inspired them, but critics accused the family of exaggeration, of turning one man's tragedy into a movement. Some HOA lobbyists even pushed for stricter powers, arguing that disruptive homeowners threatened communities. The fight was far from over, but the Carters were ready. They had inherited not only their father's scars, but his resolve. "We don't fight for revenge," Alicia often said at rallies. "We fight for the right of every person to live with dignity. That's what Dad taught us. That's what he died believing." Each year, the anniversary of the demolition became more than a family ritual. The lanterns released over the lake grew in number as neighbors, activists, and strangers came to honor James. The sky filled with light, glowing embers of resilience rising against the darkness. Children who had never met him spoke his name. Elders nodded in reverence, and always his words were spoken aloud. "They can take wood, they can take stone, but they cannot take our dignity." One year, on the 10th anniversary, the event drew so many people that local officials declared it James Carter Day. Schools held lessons on housing justice. Churches offered sermons on resilience. Newspapers carried editorials reminding readers of the cost of silence. What began as one man's loss had become a national reminder of collective responsibility. Yet through all the growth, the Carters never forgot the intimate pain at the heart of the story. They kept James's favorite chair on the porch, empty but honored. They preserved photos of the original cabin, burned and broken, as a reminder of what was taken. and every family gathering began with a prayer of thanks, not just for justice won, but for the strength to endure. For Alicia, the weight was heaviest. She often returned to the lake alone. Sitting quietly on the dock where she once held her father's shaking hands, she whispered to him across the water, telling him of each family the foundation had helped, each case they had won, each child who now had a home because of his fight. Sometimes the wind seemed to answer, rustling through the trees, reminding her that her father's spirit was never far. The Carter cabin became in time a landmark, not an official one on tourist maps, but a sacred place for those who understood what it meant. People traveled from across the country to see it, to stand on its porch, to feel the weight of its story. They didn't come for the view of the lake. They came for the lesson that dignity, once claimed, could not be erased. And so, long after bulldozers turned walls into rubble, long after courts handed down justice, long after James Carter's voice grew quiet, his story lived on. It lived in the laws that changed because of him. It lived in the families who fought back because of him. It lived in the children who grew up knowing that dignity was not given but defended. The Carter cabin stands today as more than wood and stone. It stands as testimony, as memory, as proof that injustice can wound but not define. And every time the sun sets over the lake, casting golden light across the water, it shines as if to say, they tried to erase him. Instead, they carved his name into history. Decades passed, but the story of James Carter never faded. What began as a single cabin demolished on the edge of a quiet lake had become a symbol carried across generations. Children who once released lanterns in his honor grew into adults, raising their own families on the lessons etched into James's words. His story no longer belonged to one household or one community. It belonged to history itself. The Carter cabin became a sanctuary for movements that extended beyond property rights. Civil rights leaders visited to honor James's resilience. Black entrepreneurs gathered there to discuss building generational wealth and protecting it against systemic barriers. College students came for retreats, listening to lectures about the long history of black land loss, from farms stolen after Reconstruction to homes taken during urban renewal, and yes, to one teacher's cabin demolished under false pretenses. Each visitor left with a deeper understanding that James Carter's story was not isolated, but part of a continuum of struggle and survival. The Carter grandchildren carried the torch into this new era. Isaiah, who once wrote poems about his grandfather's resilience, became a published author. His first book, Ashes Don't Mean the End, chronicled not only James's journey, but dozens of others inspired by it. The book became required reading in university courses, sparking dialogue among young people about justice, dignity, and community. His sister Naomi pursued architecture, designing affordable housing projects rooted in principles of equity and sustainability. She often said, "I build so no family has to see their home turned to rubble like Grandpa's." Alicia, though older now, continued to lead the Carter Justice Initiative. Under her guidance, the foundation had grown into a nationwide organization with offices in 20 states. They didn't just fight cases, they educated, trained, and empowered communities to stand up before injustice struck. Alicia's proudest moment came when Congress passed the Carter Fair Housing Reform Act, legislation designed to limit HOA power, strengthen due process, and protect homeowners from predatory enforcement. The law bore her father's name, cementing his legacy in the nation's legal framework. Yet for all the victories, the family never lost sight of the personal story at its core. On quiet evenings, the Carters still gathered at the cabin, cooking meals together, sharing memories, telling the youngest children about the grandfather they had never met. They spoke of his patience, his humility, his love of teaching. They reminded each other that James had not fought to become a symbol. He had fought simply to live in dignity. The fact that his life had inspired so much more was, as Alicia often said, proof that God can turn ashes into testimony. Visitors who came to the cabin often left behind tokens, letters, photographs, drawings, small carved items. The Carters kept them all in a special room they called the Memory Hall. Inside, the walls were lined with stories of families who had found strength in James's fight. A note from a widow in Alabama who saved her farm. A photo of a young boy holding the deed to his family's home in Detroit. A carved cross from a church in Mississippi that had nearly lost its land to developers. Each artifact whispered the same truth. James's dignity had become their dignity too. As the years went on, documentaries, books, and even films told the Carter story. Some dramatized it, some analyzed it, some celebrated it. But the family always insisted that the heart of the story remain true. One man's cabin, one act of injustice, one family's fight for restoration. They wanted people to remember not just the destruction and the court battles, but the man himself, the teacher who believed in fairness, the father who believed in family, the grandfather who believed that dignity was stronger than stone. On the 25th anniversary of the demolition, a crowd of thousands gathered at the lake. The Carters unveiled a bronze statue of James, seated in his teaching chair, a book in his lap and a gentle smile on his face. At the base of the statue were the words that had carried across time. They can take wood. They can take stone. But they cannot take our dignity. The unveiling was broadcast nationwide. News anchors spoke of James alongside giants of the civil rights movement. Commentators reminded viewers that history was not just written by the powerful, but by everyday people whose resilience reshaped communities. For many, James Carter became a reminder that change often begins not in courts or capitals, but in the quiet defiance of a man who refuses to be erased. Yet the most moving part of the event was not the statue or the speeches. It was when Isaiah stood before the crowd, holding a lantern like the ones his family had released every year. His voice shook as he said, "This is for you, Grandpa. For every night we cried, for every morning we rebuilt. For every lesson you left us, we will keep the light burning." He released the lantern, and soon thousands of others joined him, the night sky filled with floating lights, a river of resilience rising into the heavens. That image would be printed on the front pages of newspapers, shared across social media, framed in homes across the country. It became more than an anniversary tradition. It became a cultural symbol of endurance. Every September, lanterns were released in cities nationwide, carrying not just James's name, but the names of countless others who had faced injustice. The Carter family had sparked a ritual of remembrance, and so James Carter's story became interwoven with the nation's conscience. His cabin became a pilgrimage site, his legacy a movement, his words a mantra. Long after the bulldozers had come and gone, long after the courtroom battles had ended, long after the man himself had passed, his dignity still stood unbroken. For history, at its core, is not written only in laws or monuments. It is written in the lives we touch, the legacies we leave, and the truths we refuse to let die. James Carter left behind more than a rebuilt cabin. He left behind a reminder carved into the soul of a nation. Dignity, once claimed, can never be demolished. 50 years had passed since the day bulldozers rolled across the lakefront and tore apart the cabin of a quiet, black schoolteacher named James Carter. What was once a local tragedy, then a national story, had grown into something larger than history itself. By the mid-21st century, James Carter's name was no longer just remembered. It was taught, honored, and invoked as a moral compass for justice. Every September, schools across the country observed Carter Day, a day not marked by fireworks or parades, but by reflection. Children gathered in classrooms to hear. Their teachers read the words, engraved on James's statue. They can take wood. They can take stone, but they cannot take our dignity. Those words were copied onto chalkboards, projected onto classroom walls, and memorized by generations of students, who would carry them as a shield into adulthood. The Carter cabin had long since become a national landmark, preserved not as a museum of loss, but as a sanctuary of resilience. Tours began each morning with the sound of rushing water against the lake shore, as guides reminded visitors that this place was never about defeat. It was about the triumph of dignity over erasure. Inside, exhibits told the story not only of James, but of countless other black families who had faced injustice in housing, land ownership, and community survival. His story had opened the door for theirs to be heard. By then, Alicia had long passed, but her vision had lived on. The Carter Justice Initiative had become a global organization, fighting against property discrimination not only in America but across the world. From African farmers facing land grabs to indigenous families defending sacred grounds, the Carter name had become synonymous with protection. Judges in countries far from the lake would cite the Carter precedent as an example of law, bending toward dignity. Isaiah, now an elder himself, sat often on the cabin porch, watching his grandchildren run across the same land, where bulldozers once crushed his grandfather's dreams. His hair was white, his hands marked by years of writing and teaching, but his voice was steady. "This," he would say, gesturing at the porch, "the lake, the trees, is proof. Proof that they can tear down walls, but they cannot tear down spirit." His grandchildren listened wide-eyed, their own futures shaped by the story that was both inheritance and responsibility. Universities established Carter scholarships, dedicated to students pursuing law, social justice, architecture, or teaching. In libraries across the country, Isaiah's book Ashes Don't Mean the End remained a staple, its pages worn from decades of eager hands. One passage in particular resonated with young readers. My grandfather never asked to be a hero. He only asked to live in peace. But when peace was denied, dignity demanded he rise. And in rising, he lifted us all. Technology also carried James's story into new forms. Virtual reality experiences allowed people to walk through the original cabin, feel the ground shake as bulldozers approached, and then witness its rebirth. Students in classrooms from Los Angeles to Lagos could step into James's shoes, not as spectators but as participants in history. In those digital recreations, they felt the same sting of injustice and the same fire of resilience. Yet even with all the reverence, the Carter story remained grounded in something simple, the reminder that history repeats itself when silence prevails. Communities still faced injustice. Families still risked losing homes, and power still threatened the vulnerable. But now they carried the Carter example like armor. Whenever a neighborhood was threatened, someone would inevitably say, "Remember James Carter." They tried to silence him, and he became a voice for generations. On the 100th anniversary of the demolition, thousands gathered at the lake. By then, the Carter descendants numbered in the hundreds, scattered across professions and cities, but all converging on the cabin. The commemoration was broadcast globally, with viewers tuning in from every continent. Leaders spoke of James Carter, not only as a symbol of Black resilience, but as a universal symbol of human dignity. His story had transcended race and nation. It had become part of the world's shared heritage. At dusk, as lanterns were once again released into the sky, a child, one of James's great-great-grandchildren, stood before the crowd. She was no older than 7, her voice small but clear. My great-grandpa lost his cabin, but he gave us all a home. Not a home of wood and stone, a home in our hearts. That home can never be destroyed. Her words, innocent yet profound, brought tears to even the most seasoned leaders in the audience. Generations later, historians would write that James Carter's story reshaped the national conversation on housing justice. The Carter legacy was often compared to the civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, the labor movement, moments in history, where ordinary people carried extraordinary burdens that reshaped the future. But for the Carter family, it was never about titles or monuments or laws. For them, it always came back to a man who loved his family, loved his students, and believed in fairness. A man who once sat quietly on a porch, watching the lake, never knowing that his refusal to bow would echo across centuries. Time had proven what James himself knew on the day. His cabin was reduced to rubble. Dignity is not bound to walls, roofs, or property lines. It is not subject to boards, fines, or bulldozers. Dignity, once claimed, outlives injustice. It survives fire, corruption, and even death. It flows through bloodlines, it builds movements, it shapes nations. And so, long after his name was carved into history, long after his cabin became a shrine, long after his descendants carried the torch, the truth remained unchanged. They had demolished his cabin, but they could never demolish James Carter. The lake is quiet now. The waves kiss the shore with the same rhythm they did when James Carter sat in his chair, notebook in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. The cabin stands tall, weathered yet steadfast, its wooden frame glowing gold under the evening sun. For visitors, it is a landmark. For the Carter family, it is a living heartbeat, pulsing with memory. Every nail, every plank, every stone whispers stories of what was lost and what was reclaimed. The porch creaks with footsteps of children who never knew James, yet feel his presence in the air. The walls echo with laughter, tears, and prayers, testament to the resilience that carried one man's dignity across generations. History has many names for James Carter. Some call him a hero, others a pioneer, others still a symbol. But for those who knew him or knew of him, he was something simpler. A teacher, a father, a man who wanted only to be left in peace, to live by the water, to enjoy the fruit of his labor. He never asked to carry the weight of a movement. In truth, the movement carried him, long after his life ended. When the bulldozers came, they thought they were ending something. They thought they could erase a man's presence by flattening his cabin into splinters. They believed destruction would silence dignity. But what they could not understand is that dignity is not built of wood or nails. Dignity is breath, blood, spirit. It is passed down through the veins of children, carried in the memory of communities, engraved into the conscience of nations. James Carter's story became more than resistance. It became a mirror. A mirror reflecting centuries of injustice that too many tried to bury. A mirror reminding the world that black lives are not disposable, that black homes are not expendable, that black dignity is not negotiable. His story joined the long chain of voices that demanded the world see the truth, even when the world tried to look away. And yet his story is not one of despair, it is one of renewal. For even in the ashes of destruction, the Carters built again. Even in the silence of courts that once turned away, justice rose. Even in the face of erasure, memory endured. What was meant to be an ending became a beginning. Now when people gather at the cabin, they do not come to mourn, they come to learn. Children trace their hands along the wood, whispering the words engraved at its heart. They can take wood, they can take stone, but they cannot take our dignity. Elders nod, remembering the long journey of survival. Activists draw strength, reminding themselves that their fight is part of a greater story. The cabin is no longer just a place, it is a compass. A reminder of where we have been and a guide toward where we must go. As the sun sets each year on the anniversary of the demolition, lanterns rise into the night sky. They carry not only James's name, but the names of countless others whose dignity was tested, whose homes were lost, whose voices still echo. The sky becomes a river of light, stretching beyond sight. As if the heavens themselves are testifying, injustice does not win. Dignity does not die. For the Carters, the journey has been long, but they remain rooted in the simple truth James lived by. Family, faith, and dignity are worth more than any material possession. They know the cabin will one day weather. The wood will fade, the stone will crumble, but they also know that the legacy of James Carter does not live in timber and nails. It lives in the choices of every person who refuses to bow to injustice, who chooses to stand in dignity even when the world tries to strip it away. The story of James Carter is not confined to one family or one lake or one nation. It belongs to everyone who has ever felt the weight of erasure and chosen to rise. It belongs to every child who has been taught that dignity cannot be demolished. It belongs to the past, the present, and the future. And so, as the waves lap gently against the shore, as the lanterns rise each year, as the cabin stands resilient against time, one truth endures. They demolished his cabin. They tried to erase his life. But they only built his legacy. And as long as there are voices to tell his story, as long as there are hands to carry his name, as long as there are hearts that believe in dignity, above all else, James Carter will never be gone. Because dignity once claimed is eternal. The Carter cabin stands in twilight. The lake reflects the last streaks of sun, glowing crimson and gold, as if heaven itself were painting the water in honor of the man who once sat here, notebook in hand, quietly teaching the world what dignity means. The wind drifts through the trees with a whisper, carrying memories that never truly die. By now, generations have come and gone. The Carters have grown into a vast family tree, their branches reaching across nations, their work shaping laws, policies, and communities. Yet they all know their roots sink deeply into this soil, into this cabin, into the unshakable dignity of James Carter. When they gather, they do not speak only of pain. They speak of triumph. They speak of how one man's refusal to bow before injustice changed the course of history. Visitors arrive every day. Some come to study, others to mourn, others simply to stand in silence and feel what remains in the air. They walk the porch where James once prayed, sit in the chair where he once rested, and look across the same waters that reflected his sorrow and his strength. They come with questions, but leave with conviction. Dignity cannot be demolished. The Carter cabin is no longer simply a landmark. It is sacred ground. Scholars write of it as they write of Selma, Montgomery, and Tulsa, a place where injustice collided with resilience, and resilience endured. Children visit on school trips, standing wide-eyed as guides tell them how bulldozers once tore down walls, thinking they were tearing down a man. And every child leaves knowing that those bulldozers failed. For the Carter family, anniversaries remain moments of reflection. Each year, lanterns rise into the night sky, carrying James's name alongside. The names of others whose lives remind us that injustice is never the final word. The lanterns float upward, glowing softly, a river of light that no darkness can smother. And with every lantern released, the words echo again. They can take wood, they can take stone, but they cannot take our dignity. Isaiah, now among the elders, writes his final reflection by hand, sitting at his grandfather's desk inside the cabin. His letter is addressed not to his children or grandchildren, but to those he will never meet, the future. If you read this, he writes, know that dignity is your inheritance. Protect it, guard it. Do not surrender it, no matter what the world takes from you. My grandfather's cabin was demolished, but in the ruins we found our strength. You will face your own bulldozers, your own battles. When you do, remember James Carter. Remember that they cannot take what lives in your spirit. He sets the letter in the memory hall, where thousands of others have left their stories. And so the Carter legacy does not end. It passes forward like fire, lit in one generation and carried by the next. The cabin becomes less of a monument and more of a mirror, reflecting the truth that every community has its James Carter. Every family has its story of resilience. Every person has their own dignity to defend. His story reminds us that justice is never a single victory, but a continuous journey. The closing chapter of James Carter's life is not death, but transformation. He became more than man, more than memory. He became a testament written into the conscience of a nation, a reminder that homes can fall, property can be taken, but the soul of a people cannot be bulldozed. And so, as the camera of memory pulls back, past the cabin, past the lake, past the lanterns rising into the vastness of night, the voice of James Carter seems to echo once more. Calm yet unshakable, the voice of a teacher who knew that truth lasts longer than stone. They demolished my cabin. They thought they had taken everything. But in truth, they gave us something greater, proof that dignity, once claimed, can never be destroyed. The screen fades to black, and the story of James Carter does not end. It lives on, in the cabin, in the family, in the world that finally learned. Dignity is eternal.